Here, the session is already recorded. So, good afternoon once again, grade 8. This will be our very first meeting and input when it comes to grammar. I might as well do a full screen. Maybe I'll do full
Or
screen.
that will relate to the
Wait,
past scenario.
I cannot see
You'll
everyone.
hear or you will read
Never mind. Anyway, I'll use the chat
an
box.
indicator and it might
Someone sent a
be
message.
the word
I told you not to use the chat box. Ken Jose Adayo.
3 years
Why
ago
did you type something in the
or
chat
5 years
box?
ago.
Did I not just say
These are
earlier not to
ages
use
in
the
the
chat
past.
box?
And for those ages in the future, perhaps
Ken,
incorporate it to the
I'm
present
going to push
five
this
years
message that you sent upwards because I'd like that when your classmates browse over the chat box later on, I think you can see that the chat
So
box is
these
moving up.
phrases will tell us
The lines would
that
tell you that anything
is
that
a
came
valid
before these
requirement
lines is not
these
related for
ages in the
our
past,
discussion.
indicators or the
Okay, there.
phrases that will be pertaining to the
Now we begin with the
Instead of finding the
discussion
tense of the
on
verb,
clauses.
finding for what tense of the verb, you need to find the indicator.
Your module tells you
In
that a
Filipino, we call
clause
as
is composed
adverb
of three important requirements.
Mag-aabay ng kapanahon. Tawag natin sa
By the way,
verb.
before I go with
English
clauses and its
talaga
requirements,
time.
grammar has what we call
So
as
we need to find these
fragments.
words to indicate what
Fragments in
age
grammar
is that
correspond to a
parent
mere
pattern
group
indicates.
of words.
And after
When
that,
you
we will
dissect
take
a
up
sentence and have the dissection
we have this
in
age
terms of the
table.
words
If there
that
are two
make up a
persons
sentence,
involved, you name them
you'll end up with
person one,
fragments.
person two.
Fragments could come
And
in two
then
possible
the
types.
next two
You can
freedoms
have a
will be the
fragment which
past
you
and
could
present
consider a
continuous.
phrase, and you can have another one which you
Anong
could
gusto mo
call a
gagawin natin
clause.
na
This
gamitin?
time,
Variable
our
X
focus
or
is
variable
for
N? Most
clauses.
likely, we use the constant
What
X.
are the requirements for a clause
So let's
to
say
be
you say
called
that
a
variables
clause?
provided
Your
that
module
it
contains
has
this,
different
but
meanings.
allow me to reiterate that in the
So
chat
this
box.
is what we call as the
A
age table.
clause is a clause
The table
because
of the age
it
of the
is a
person, and it
group
will be
of words.
replacing, or this table will
Second
replace
requirement,
with an
in that
algorithm.
group of words,
Mayroon tayo dito algorithm na ilalagay. Ano yung
that
algorithm?
group,
Paano
ah,
natin
that
algebraic
group of words
x plus
contains a
5 plus
subject
2x plus
and
10,
a
2x minus 2, something like
predicate.
that. These are algorithm
By
or
simple definition,
algebraic
a
expression
predicate
to
is a
specify
verb.
the age of person 1
That's the
in the
simplest
past,
definition that we
present,
could
and
have
the
for
future.
a predicate. It's a verb.
Is it
Anything
possible,
that
sir,
comes
to
together with that
create
verb
one column,
happens to be
one
part
row?
of the
Yes.
predicate group or
If
predicate
the
group
problem
of
is only
words.
asking for the past age,
The
let's say
third
for one
requirement,
column for past.
that
What
group
is
of
the
words
column for
must
future and present age?
contain a thought,
Then there is no need for you to write all
a
of the
thought
columns here and there.
which
It depends on what the
could
subject
be
will be.
complete
Should we
or
proceed?
incomplete.
Let's
Again,
continue
that's the
then.
third. Those are the
This
three
example
important
will now tell
requirements
us
for a clause
how you are
to
going to
be called a
apply
clause. Actually,
age
these
table.
three are just found in your
I think
module.
this is in your module, no?
You don't really have to write them down because
Experiment.
they are there. I
Nasa
also,
ba?
what I'm proud of with your module, I've already made four of your modules, three of your modules. I wrote them, I typed them down myself.
12 years older than 11, 5 years
I
ago.
mean, I made the module
So let's have this
by
understood
looking at
in
what I've
parallel
known of
blending
grammar and I
the
typed them down.
age table.
And so, if you
What
look
is
at
the
the first
problem? Why is
paragraph
it
in
12
your
years older
module,
than David?
these
What is
three
the problem?
requirements are
Because how
actually
does it
there.
evolve? And
Look,
David?
a clause is a group of words. That's requirement one. That contains a subject and a predicate, which is a simple verb. That's requirement two. That group of words delivers a thought which can be complete or incomplete. That is requirement number three.
Therefore,
However, if
group
you
of
felt like writing
variables
it
that
down
will tell the
separately
age
for the
of David.
purpose of familiarity,
And
then that's
this
fine. I highly
alone
welcome it.
class,
I won't
the
stop you.
sentence
For
started
whatever it
12
is
years
that's
older
going
than
to help
David.
you
Is
be
it
more
a present
familiar of
age?
our
Is it
discussion,
a past
go for
age?
it.
Or is it
Go
a
and do that.
future age?
Let's go now and focus on the third criterion for a clause to be called a
But
clause.
present age. Kasi tingnan natin
It is
dito,
said
tingnan
that
natin
that
yung
group
verb.
of words contains a thought which could be complete or incomplete.
Look at
If the
the
thought
verb.
is
The verb is
complete,
a simple
the
present.
clause is
Present, yeah, right?
independent.
And whether or not you will not consider is as an indicator, wala tayong ibang
Wait,
indicator of
the clause?
being
Wait,
past or
for a while,
future.
sorry.
Therefore, the sentence Carmen is 12 years older than David is a present age.
There.
Balik tayo
The
mga
clause
Carmen.
is independent
Carmen,
if the
years
thought
older
is
than
incomplete.
David.
An
So,
independent
tayo
clause,
variable kung ano ang edad ni David.
dependent,
Assuming that David in present
an independent
is
clause
X.
can also be called
So therefore,
a
Carmen is 12 years
main
older than
clause.
David. Nakikita niyo ba?
So please do not be surprised if from time to time I call it an independent clause. I also call it a main clause. They are actually just the same thing. In the completeness of the thought of an independent or a main clause, it can then be called as well a sentence. An independent clause
Let's say David is 10 years
is
old.
a sentence in itself.
10 as well. But we don't
Since
say
that
David
independent clause has a complete thought, it can stand on its own. And that's what we simply need for a sentence to exist. We need to have a group of words capable of standing on its own, and so we could have a sentence. By definition, that's what an independent clause is also doing. And so we have this parallelization, an independent clause, which is also a sentence in itself.
Any other questions that might lead to some
Questions so far?
There's none, let's proceed.
Any question?
Nakita niyo sa second column.
We go now with our dependent clause.
Yes.
The clause is dependent if the thought is incomplete. A dependent clause
So 5 years ago, the sum of
can
the ages
also
is 28.
be called
Huwag natin i-assume yung
a
sum of
subordinate
the
clause.
correct.
So please do not be surprised as well if from time to time I don't use the term dependent clause, but I call it a subordinate clause. In contrast to the independent clause, the dependent clause cannot stand on its own. And so what will a dependent clause do? The dependent clause attaches itself to an independent clause
The sum of their ages
for that dependent clause to exist in a sentence. Now, can an independent clause survive without a dependent clause? Shamil.
present age or will be at a past age?
Shamil?
Do you think so? Present or past?
Can an independent clause survive without the dependent clause?
Good. Ato ta sa past mo. Kailangan sa second sentence.
Correct. It
The sum
definitely
is
can.
part of the
Because
sentence
in itself,
containing
again,
the past
an independent clause is a sentence. What about the dependent clause? Can the dependent clause survive without the independent clause? Elijah.
12 minus 5 plus. 12 minus 5 is 7.
Correct.
Right? So,
The dependent clause cannot stand on its own. It needs an independent clause. I hope that's clear to everyone. Another thing that we need to be reminded of with dependent clauses is that dependent clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions. There are plenty of conjunctions around you. There's this category that we need to be reminded of as that category of conjunctions that start a dependent clause. Therefore, if you are requested to identify the dependent clause in a sentence, make sure that that dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction. If you cannot make that dependent clause start with a subordinating conjunction, unfortunately, your answer is incorrect. When I give STs of this kind in Edmodo, it just might appear that at least one item there would require that you determine the dependent clause in a sentence. Make sure that the dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction. Let's have a sample sentence. Example 1. Let's have examples here. Number 1.
So therefore, at present, David is X. So David is 13 years old. While Carmen or Carmen is X plus 12. And since X is 13, so 13.
The lady was sad because her dog died. Let's examine it in terms of its parts. What will you consider in that sentence to be the independent clause? Let's start with it. Once again, we remind ourselves of what an independent clause is. It has to be a group of words with a subject and a predicate capable of delivering a complete thought. In fact, if you end the sentence in that independent clause, that sentence can exist on its own. Going back to the example, the lady was sad because her dog died. What is our independent clause, Jonard?
Louise is 26 years old. Her daughter is 4 years old.
Correct. The lady was sad.
And that age of them.
Sir, why did you put a period after the independent clause? You look at my answer. You look at the answer I placed in the chat box. I placed a period after sad. Why did I place a period after sad? Because if you look at the notes I placed in the chat box, it says that an independent clause in itself is a sentence. And sentences need to be ended with punctuation marks, with end marks, which in this case happens to be a period. What is our dependent clause? Chloe. Correct. You look at the answer in the chat box. Because her dog died. Is there a period after died? There's none. Why? Because a dependent clause is not a sentence. It cannot stand on its own. Please keep this in mind. Dependent clauses do not have end marks. They should not be provided with end marks. And also, you look at the word because. Chloe gave us an answer that begins with the word because, since because is a subordinating conjunction. If you want to know what the list of subordinating conjunctions contains, feel free. You have your books in grammar last year in elementary. You can also browse online to look for the list of subordinating conjunctions. We cannot be limited only to the word because, since. We cannot be limited only to them. In fact, when is a subordinating conjunction? Which, that, who, they are subordinating conjunctions. What about this? I'll give you another example. Wait.
Is April still a birthday? Yes. Hindi ko nakikita si April. Ayun, April. Para April. Ayan. Gusto ko lang marinig si April.
There.
Gusto ko lang marinig yung voice.
I hope everybody could see sentence number 2. Mother came home early because of her work. Now, what is our independent clause? I'd like to call Jeremiah. What is our independent clause? Correct. Mother knows best. How do we end with an independent clause, Jeremiah?
L for Louis, D for daughter. What will
Correct. With an end mark, which in this, our choice of an end mark depends on the end mark of the original sentence. In this case, it is with a period. So that's our independent clause. What is our dependent clause? I'd like to ask Angel. Here's the catch with because. In the answer given by Angel, because of her work, I want you to consider the words that make up that group, that fragment.
Do not make it.
Again, the answer of Angel is because of her work. Is there a subject in that group of words?
Like for example,
You look at because of her work. Is there a subject?
14. So
If you say that there's a subject, what is the verb? You can only call a noun a subject if it is paired with a predicate or a verb. If you don't have a predicate or a verb, that means the noun is not a subject at all. So going back, what is the dependent clause in sentence number 2? I'd like to ask Rafael.
N equals to the, and that is indeed the correct algorithm.
Rafael?
Lewis is, in mathematics, is equals man.
Yes, Rafael?
Lewis is twice the daughter's age.
What is our dependent clause in number 2?
And in any way you look at it, that is actually correct. See, Lewis is twice the daughter's age. So this is our algorithm. Look at the presentation.
What about Mikaela? What is our dependent clause in number 2?
In the words of Lewis, I told to you. Lewis is now twice the age of her daughter. Si Lewis is L, si daughter letter D. Balik tayo kanina.
Chelsea, what about you, Chelsea? What is our dependent clause in number 2?
Gamitan natin yan dito. So, L is the
Dependent clause.
D 4 plus D. And since D is twice, so 2 multiplied by 2.
A clause, let's be reminded, a clause needs to be composed of a subject and a predicate.
And then,
Obviously, that makes it a group of words.
Just simple mathematics, combine like terms.
Angel, would you like to change your answer from earlier?
3 to the right, so that is 26 equals 8 minus t, because 2t minus
Again,
3
sorry.
is t, or 1t. Transpose 8 on the other side, so that will
If
be
I ask you now the question, for number 2, what is the dependent clause? What's going to be your answer?
Louis' age will double her daughter's
So
age.
sorry, but I didn't hear anything. Sorry. I'll just call another one. Jeremiah, what's the dependent clause in number 2?
Mahirap na talaga yung pag-understand sa problem. But if you already have the algorithm, everything is easy because this is simple mathematics naman. This is where problem solving is much more difficult to construct
Yes, Jeremiah?
an algorithm. Again, what is an algorithm? It's just a derived
Hala.
to arrive at a solution.
Better yet, does number 2 have a dependent clause?
I don't think you can hear
It
me,
does not,
but please
correct.
give me feedback because
There's no dependent clause in number 2. Sir, the word because is there. Yes, obviously it is. But look at the words that come after because. Can you see a subject? We can. Can we see a noun though? We can. And that noun is work. But what is the function of work in this sentence? It is not a subject. Rather, it is an object of the prepositional expression because of. Okay, so take note of this. Because, that is a conjunction. Because of
yes, po.
preposition. Please take note of that. Again, because, just the word because, if what you'll find is just the word because, then that is a conjunction. But if you see the expression because of, that expression is actually a preposition, which makes, wait, for a while, I'm typing something. Which makes because of her work a prepositional phrase, not a clause. Because the word work is the object of the preposition because of. Please keep that. I hope you have noted that down. If I see the word because, okay, and just the word because, that's a conjunction. But if I see the expression because of, because there is not a conjunction, it is part of a preposition. The same goes with after and before. After and before may be conjunctions, but they can also be prepositions. Let's have sample number 3. Example number 3. Um,
And it pays me to probably it pays a lot for you to read it on your own and understand it on your own. However, for now, I'll try myself to solve a
there.
problem.
We had gone to the mall before father came home. That's our sentence. What is our independent clause in this sentence? Angel.
Just choose a number.
Correct. We had gone to the mall. How are we going to end this sentence, Angel? Do we place a punctuation mark after the word mall? Correct. We should, because this is an independent clause. Like what I said earlier, independent clauses are already sentences in themselves. Now let's examine the dependent clause. Do we have a dependent clause in this sentence, Lian? Correct, we do. What is that dependent clause, Lian?
Okay, so let's solve number 1. Everyone, pay close attention to the
Correct. Before father came home. Will we end this with a period, Lian? Oh? Are we? Liam, what about Liam? Will we end this with a period? We will not. Why, Liam? Why will we not end this with a period? Correct. Exactly the reason. Since it is not a complete sentence, it has to just be stated as before father came home. No end mark. Dependent clauses are not sentences. And also consider this dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction before. But here's sentence number 4. Sentence number 4 will use the word before, but not as a conjunction.
A boy is 10 years older than his brother. Ang tanong, saan nagre-refer si boy sa kanyang age? Si brother. So, i-assume natin si brother is X. So, si boy, anong edad ni boy? 10 years
The sentence
older.
is, before the submission of my projects, we went to my friend's house. You look at the use of the word before. You look at before there. What words come after before? You have the submission of the projects.
So, stop mo tayo dyan. In 4 years,
Does that sentence, the sentence number 4, contain a dependent clause?
X plus
Jillian.
And then, si brother, in 4 years is X plus 4. Okay?
Jillian.
Gagawa na tayo na ngayon ng algorithm.
I'll call someone else. Genova.
He will be twice as old as his brother.
Does number 4 contain a dependent clause?
Twice as old as his brother. Most likely same with
Are you sure? Let's go back to the requirements for a clause to be called a clause.
X,
Group of words. Okay, obvious. You look at that group of words before the submission of the projects, ha? Our focus and attention should be on before the submission of the projects, just up to that part. Obviously, it is a group of words. It is. Second, does it contain a subject? Genova, is there a subject in before the submission of the projects?
transpose values to the left and to the right, or simplify first the right.
By the way, before you examine a subject to be a subject, take note that you can only call a noun a subject if it is paired with a predicate, if it goes together with a verb. Jonard, can you see a predicate in before the submission of the projects?
X to the right side of the equation, it will become negative X.
Is there a verb in that group of words?
And when we combine vectors, it's basically what? 14 minus 8.
Look at the in before the submission of the projects.
6.
What's the verb?
2x minus x is equal to x. Therefore, x is equal to 6. And the question is, find
There's
the
none.
pages.
There's actually none.
X is
The is a determiner. It's an article. Submission is a noun. Of is a preposition. The is an article. Projects is a noun. We don't have any verb. So in sentence number 4, we don't have a dependent clause.
simplify every bit of information.
So what is the independent clause in number 4? Actually, in number 4, the independent clause is the sentence itself as well. The completeness of the sentence corresponds to the independent clause. Actually, the same should go to number 2. Sentence number 2. Allow me to put some corrections there. For sentence number 2, the independent clause actually is mother came home early because of her work. Please extend that. It's not just mother came home early, but it should be mother came home early because of her work. That's the complete independent clause, since we don't have a dependent clause. In sentence number 4, the word before functions as a preposition. In fact, you have there a prepositional phrase. Sorry, I'm going to type that in. That's your prepositional phrase. The preposition is before. See, I hope you can see the difference between sentence number 3 and sentence number 4 in terms of the use of the word before. In sentence number 3, before has been used as a conjunction because the words that come after it are inclusive of a subject and a predicate or a verb. While in number 4, the words that come after before do not include a predicate or a verb. And once again, you can only call a noun a subject if and only if it is paired with a predicate, which by simple definition is a verb. Questions? Please, I beg you, ask. Because if there's none, I'll proceed. Clauses, dependent clauses shall be our focus for this afternoon, not the independent one. I mean, what is there to focus with the independent clause when we know already that it's a sentence? It can stand as a sentence. We bring our attention to the dependent clause. Dependent clauses as modifiers. So that's our focus here. In fact, if you look at the name of the lesson, it's called clauses that modify. So we are talking here of dependent clauses. Independent clauses do not modify because they are sentences. It's the dependent clause that we should focus our attention into because they are the dependent clauses that can only take on a modifying function. As modifiers, dependent clauses can be adjectives,
one item between
They can also be
7 to 14.
adverbs.
Sige,
To this, we can have an adjectival clause and an adverbial clause. Sometimes you'll find it labeled as adjective clause or adverb clause. But sometimes I also call them adjectival or adverbial. Actually, they're just the same. Let's trace the definition or the function of the adjective. Adjectives are modifiers to what parts of speech, Chloe? What parts of speech are described or modified by adjectives?
sana nasusunod si ate mo.
There are two parts of speech which could be modified by an adjective. What parts of speech are they? Gabriel. Correct. Adjectives describe nouns and or pronouns. What about adverbs, Gabriel? What do they modify? Verbs, correct. What else?
Anyways, to proceed. The sum of the ages of wood clock and a bronze clock is 20 years.
Like if you say, I am so happy. So modifying happy.
Wood clock. Find the present.
They also modify?
Okay, tingnan natin to sa table 4.
Jeremiah, aside from verbs, what else are modified by adverbs? Adjectives, correct. And what's the third group?
Clock.
Correct. See, that definition has always been the definition of an adverb ever since you were in elementary. Ever since I was an elementary student, that has always been the definition of an adverb.
Present. Okay.
An adverb is a modifier to a verb, an adjective to or to another adverb. An adjective is a word that describes a noun or a pronoun.
Past age.
Bring those definitions in mind. Don't lose them because they'll really help you in this discussion. We shall start with
Bronze clock is
the adjectival clauses.
ano yung isasabi?
These adjectival clauses,
Wood clock.
these clauses are also
Ano yung
called
gusto nyo i-suggest na age?
relative clauses. These clauses begin
Ways in which
with
you can solve
relative pronouns, also called as relative conjunctions.
wood clock age and the bronze clock age.
What are our relative pronouns? Relative pronouns are these words.
Hanap tayo ng magsasuggest.
You may have which, who,
Dito
that,
tayo sa
whose,
sentence.
whom,
Some
when, and even where can function as a relative pronoun. So when you see one, take note, a relative conjunction is a subordinating conjunction. I mean, we use them for relative clauses, and relative clauses are dependent clauses. Therefore, a relative conjunction is a subordinating conjunction.
anyone, no?
A relative conjunction starts a dependent clause. For example, here's our example.
X si bronze. Anong edad mo?
I hope you don't mind that I'm not anymore going to dwell with the examples found in the module so that we can have more sample sentences. There are already sentences in the module. I'm adding more sentences with the examples that I have in the chat box. Examples. Number 1.
Very good. 20 minus 10. Kung ano edad ni X, isasampang mo yan muna sa 20, kaya yung edad ni Wood. Ibig sabihin, if bronze is 15 years old, the wood clock
There.
is 5 years old.
The farmer whose house was burned went to the market.
Hindi na sila yung
You should be careful of how to dissect a sentence that contains a relative pronoun. A relative clause or an adjective clause, adjectival clause. Why? Adjective clauses can be found within sentences.
variable.
They could also be found at the last part of a sentence. And the danger here is
Age of
you might include a word in that relative clause that supposedly belongs to the independent clause. A relative clause is a dependent clause. Therefore, it attaches itself as well to a sentence or to an independent clause. How would we know, sir, which one to pick out as our relative clause or adjective clause? You read the sentence, you try to remove words, and see if the ones you are left with constitute a complete sentence that has a sensible meaning. Take, for instance, again, sentence number 1. What is our independent clause here? If you don't mind, I'll give the independent clause first for sentence number 1, and you can do the rest of the sentences later on. For number 1, our independent clause is the farmer went to the market. Will I end the independent clause with a period? I should. See, that's our independent clause. The farmer went to the market. So which ones did I remove? Which ones did I take out? I took out the words whose house was burned because that is our dependent clause. And now let's look at its function. How do we know that it functions as an adjective? Let's look at the word that comes before the dependent clause. What word comes before the dependent clause? Genova. I hope Genova could turn her mic on already. What word is found before the dependent clause? I think that's an audio problem in Genova's case. I'd like to call Thomas. Thomas, what word can you find before the dependent clause? No response. Mikaela. There, Thomas. Go, Thomas. I cannot hear anything. I'll call Mikaela. What word can you find before the dependent clause? Correct. It's the word farmer. To what part of speech does the word farmer belong, Elijah?
It's not as hard as it seems actually, class. But if you just have to
Elijah?
be specific with the details of the problem,
it's a noun. And earlier, Gabriel defined that as an adjective describes a noun. Therefore, this dependent clause definitely functions as an adjective. Also, if you interpret sentence number 1, you would arrive at the question of who was that type or who was that kind of farmer who went to the market? It's that farmer whose house was burned. That makes it an adjective. I'll give you sentence number 2, and I hope you evaluate it in the same way that I did. I'll be asking you to determine the independent clause and the dependent clause.
What will I do next?
Wait,
how will I simplify April? Could be the best option for me to do in order for me to simplify the equation. Yes, we need to simplify. But what's the best option for us to do? And that option should eliminate fractions. Distribute, yes, but it will cater to a 1/2 x.
There.
Which will give us a fraction.
What is the independent clause? Our sentence is, moments after the incident, the land which was owned by the lady was raided by the cops. Again, moments after the incident, the land which was owned by the lady was raided by the cops. Now, what is our independent clause in this sentence? Jeremiah?
Tapos, dito, multiply tayo ng 2 din. In any solution,
Correct. How do we end the
actually,
sentence?
towards the end of the solution, we actually did cross
Correct.
multiplication here. But we'll not
That's
cross
the
multiplication. Instead,
independent
we use
clause.
multiplication
Sir,
to
why is it that moments after the incident
the
is
left side
included?
is now
Because
2
that's a phrase
times
which is
x
part of
times 4,
the
and the right side
independent
is now
clause.
equal to
The independent clause
2c
contains
minus x.
phrases.
May tanong po ba tayo?
On its own, there could be plenty
Since
of
2 times
phrases
1 half
inside
is equal
one
to...
independent
Sir,
clause.
pwede ba na ako distribute? Yes, actually,
And so, what is our dependent clause?
I'm just trying
Jonard.
to eliminate the use of a fraction. But actually, later on, if you will apply fractions in the solution, it will still give you the same answer.
Correct.
But as a grade 9 student,
That is
ignore
our
fractions. And the best option
dependent
here is to
clause.
eliminate fractions from
Sir,
the solution.
why is it that I cannot see any
5,
subject in the
start
dependent
substituting
clause?
2 to x
Is
raised to
there a
1
verb? There
minus
is. It's
8
the word
is
was.
equal
It's
to
the verb was
13
owned.
minus x.
That
Why like this?
dependent
When
clause
both next to
holds a
x on the left
subject.
side and
The
minus 8
subject
on your
is
right side, so the rate
represented
x
by the
plus x.
relative pronoun
Whereas the right side
which,
is 16 plus 8.
because that
So
pronoun
if you
refers to the
exchange
word
with x
land in
and
the
16 plus
original
8 is
sentence.
24. What will you do next?
Still,
When you
the
get to the
dependent
original
clause
land, what
has
to do
a
next? Divide both
subject.
sides by 3.
It may not be
So
the
what
same
will
as
get
that
to
of the
divide by
first
3?
sentence, but
Just
there is a
multiply 3 with 3,
subject
so
in
3
number
x is
2
3.
in your
3 x divided by 3
dependent
is
clause.
x, while 24 divided
In
by
number
3
2, the
is 8.
dependent clause
Therefore,
holds a
what
subject
is now the
that is
answer? 8
represented by
of
the
12.
relative pronoun
Each clock in
which.
the present is,
Sentence number
for
3.
the bronze clock, we have 8 years old.
For a while.
And for the tawag ito, wood clock, this is 20 minus 8 is equal to 12 years old. So to check natin, 12 plus 20 equals, or rather 12 plus 8 equals 20, and that will suffice the first sentence. The sum of the ages of both wood and
Wait for a
bronze
while.
clock is 20 years. Practice lang class, basically dito, practice
Wait.
lang. There's no much with what there's not much that I can say as a secret in order to solve each and every problem here. The best way to understand problem solving is constant correct practice. I mean, if that is not even correct, constant practice will do. No? Because most of the time, our practice
Sentence number 3. The clown in our class, which is composed of many boys, was asked, was asked to go to the office. My gosh. Asked to go to the office. Please, that's so embarrassing. Please bear with the correction. The clown in our class, which is composed of many boys, was asked to go to the office of the principal. Okay, that's a pardon the error. What is the independent clause in that sentence? May I know who these 4 other students are? There are still students whom I haven't called. Clara. Clara. Hello, Clara. There's no response from Clara. Angel, I'd like to give the floor once again to you. Can you give me the independent clause in sentence number 3? Was asked to go to the office of the principal. How do we end this independent clause?
Questions before we end the call. I think I will end my discussion here. I will leave you with the other
With A?
for you to work on.
Correct. So that's the independent clause. And what is our dependent clause, Chloe?
I had my solution in number 12, so we are left with 11
Correct.
items to work on.
Will we end that with a period, Chloe? We won't. Correct. Because that's a dependent clause. It's not a sentence yet. For number 2 and number 3, please be reminded, these dependent clauses are modifying nouns. In number 2, it's modifying the word land, which is a noun. In number 3, it's modifying the word class, which is also a noun. And modifiers to nouns are what we call as adjectives. Thus, for sentences 1, 2, and 3, we have adjective clauses. Even if we go with the sentences found in the module, he who needs to answer the test must have a good score. The clause that is underlined, who needs to answer the test, describes a pronoun. And an adjective is a modifier either to a noun or pronoun. And so that clause is adjectival in nature. So see how many sample sentences do you have now? 8. 3, 5 in your module, and 3, which I also gave here in the chat box. I would not anymore want to, for the continuation of this, I'll go with the discussion on Thursday for the continuation on adverb clauses, after which we proceed with the checking of the activities from FTs 1 to 5.
Sure thing.
That's what I did. I did my best to provide you with at least 5 examples in the module. The good thing here is, if it happens that your answers in the module are not correct, there is a point of learning that you could really learn, you could really get on Thursday. And please, if you have questions as of this time, now's a good opportunity to raise them. Ask whatever you should ask regarding the discussion that we just had. And one thing that I want to also make sure is, I hope I wasn't going too fast with the discussion. Do we have some confusions or questions?
So that is something that we cannot do it anymore.
I hope that we aren't so slow as well. How do you find this idea of having the chat box be used for the notes? Do you find it all right? Because this is the main reason why in the orientation I really said that the chat box is not going to be used by the students, because like what happened now, you could see the notes here, and in the recording you will find these notes in the video.
Thank you for your attendance. Thank you.
Questions. Please, I beg you ask. But if there's none for now, okay, you may, while answering the FTs, your questions might just come out by then. Be ready with those questions on Thursday. And for that will be all. Thank you so much for your time, grade 8. Goodbye and thank you.